please forgive me. And it's Carolyn. But we did have the conversation about it, and it's very difficult to remember whether it's Caroline or Carolyn.
My
anyway,
sincere apologies. I knew it would happen, Carolyn.
That's absolutely fine. I'm so used to it. But people who know me know that I don't like being called it, so I always have to have a dig. Anyway, thank you very much for the intro, Nikki. And thanks very much to Fumi for the invitation. I'm going to talk about my PhD, which was looking at the impact of input format on an integrated EAP listening into writing task. The study was part funded by the British Council Assessment Research Awards and Grants Scheme, so thanks also to the British Council for that. And obviously I'd like to extend my thanks to Professor Tony Green and Dr. John Field for their advice and feedback, and also to the team in the Assessment Research Group at the British Council for their unfailing support and encouragement while I was battling through this thing that's the PhD. And those of us that have been there know just what a trauma that can be. Okay, so just to give you a quick overview, I'm just going to speak briefly about the background to the study and give some information about the literature that is out there in this field. Then I'll talk you through the methodology and the results, and I'll end with some implications and conclusions. I must apologise now. I've been ill for a couple of weeks, so if I cough and splutter or if my voice suddenly gives up, I do apologise. But I have got a glass of water at the ready. So, okay, so starting with the background, this study came from the shift in recent years from discrete skills testing to integrated testing. And because I worked in an academic environment, I felt that integrated skills testing was more in line with the demands of the academic environment. And that was backed up by the literature in terms of it reflecting the TLU domain by being more authentic. It's also based around an interactionist approach to language learning, whereby language knowledge is constructed through the interpretation and expression of relevant ideas through multiple media. And obviously, when you watch a lecture, an EAP lecture, normally you see the person, you would normally have some visual aids, and you would have the auditory channel as well. So this felt like it was more authentic to look at how audio-visual input impacted on performance compared to the more traditional audio only that we tend to have in more normal, if you like, more regular listening tests. And real-life performance is seen as the criterion of choice by which to judge performance, so that seemed to make sense to me. Also, there was the move from the traditional classroom to the flipped classroom. This was pre-pandemic, but there was a start towards putting lectures online for students to access before the class, so that when they came into class, they could do more interactive tasks with their colleagues. So I started to wonder about whether students would actually perform better when the input is presented as a podcast for online listening, or as a vodcast, i.e. as a video with or without PowerPoint slides. That is a videoed version of a traditional lecture, really. So I looked into the literature, and what I found was that a lot of work had been done in the area of listening. Lots of studies have looked at so factors affecting listening, but a lot of studies have looked at input formats in listening tests, sometimes with video and audio, sometimes with context video, sometimes with content visuals, so stills, but there didn't seem to be anything that really looked at an EAP lecture as an audio-visual input compared to just an audio-only input with a follow-up task. But some research had looked at the use of captions in listening comprehension, so it had looked at multimedia approaches, and a number of studies have looked at academic listening, but sort of sometimes more with the focus on note taking and how different approaches impacted on note taking performance. In terms of writing research, some writing research has looked at the processes involved in writing, some of the models behind writing. A lot of research has looked at the performance on independent versus integrated tests, and a good deal of research has looked at integrated writing tasks, but most of those focus on reading into writing. There are a couple on listening and reading into writing, but there are very few on listening into writing. So this brought me to some research questions. So the first one was, how does performance on an integrated listening into writing EAP task differ when test takers are presented with lecture input in the form of a podcast or a vodcast? I was also interested in the extent to which test takers are influenced by the written word in an EAP lecture, so what they see on the PowerPoint slides compared to what they hear from the lecturer speaking. And I was also interested in how they perceived their performance. So I wanted to find out from test takers why they felt they performed better when they were presented with one input format than the other, or why in fact they felt that they had performed worse, and what was it about the input format that had led to these perceptions. So moving on to the methodology. The participants for my study came from two universities. One was in the Russian Federation and one was in Ukraine. In total, there were 116 participants. 56 were from the Russian Federation and 42 were from the Ukraine. There was a considerable majority of females, as you can see here, 86 females compared to 26 males, but that just represents the typical division of language students in these countries. And their self-declared language level was between A1 and C1, whereby the majority were here in the B1, B2 bracket, which was exactly what exactly the range that the task was designed to target. So the study involved students completing 4 tasks. First of all, they had to do a short multiple choice lexicogrammatical test, and that was really so that I could see what their level of proficiency was and divide them into 2 groups accordingly. After that, they got the EAP lecture input. Now, in this case, the lecture input was approximately 13 minutes in total. They were able to listen to it twice, but the information was presented in 2 halves. So the lecture was sort of cut in half. In the first half, they got audio input. So what they saw was just a black screen, as you can see here. And then in the other half, they got video input. So they would see me, much as you're seeing me now, as a little icon in the corner, and then the PowerPoint slides. It was a counterbalanced measures design, so one group got the audio first and then the video, and the other group got the video first and then the audio. After that, they were required to write a summary of the lecture. They had 45 minutes and they were told to write around about 350 words if they could. And then finally, they had to fill in a test taker feedback questionnaire. And this was to gather demographic evidence, but also, as I said, just to find out the perceptions about how well they performed and what impacted on their performance as they perceived it. So I'm going to focus on those last 3 tasks, whereby the main emphasis will be on tasks 2 and 3, and I'll just give you a brief overview of the test taker perceptions at the end. So in terms of the lecture input, as I said, it was about 13 minutes in total. It was actually 12 minutes, 42 seconds, of which 33 seconds were the introduction and the outline, and 9 seconds was the close. So when I discounted those 2 parts, there were 12 minutes of content, and that was divided into 6 minutes and 14 seconds in part 1 and 5 minutes 46 in part 2. To try to keep the two halves as even as possible, each half had 3 slides. So there was one slide with 1 sentence on it, one slide with 5 bullet points, and one slide with a diagram showing 5 keywords in each part of the lecture. I analysed the input text using Text Inspector, but before I did that, I cleaned the data to remove repeated sounds such as we, were, probably, or false starts such as I'm going to, oh, I did this, and so on. But hesitations such as and were left in. I also removed the introduction and the lecture close from the analysis because what I was interested in was what students produced from the main body of the content of the lecture. So when I analysed it using Text Inspector, this was the result. I looked at these measures here, and as you can see, across parts 1 and 2, the results were fairly similar. I also looked at the CEFR tokens. I looked at the CEFR types as well, but I haven't put the results in here just for the sake of time and space. But again, the results were fairly similar. The only big difference that you see here is with AWL all tokens percentage, where it was 4.98% in part 1 and 8.2% in part 2. But in that case, in the second part, there was a lot of repetition of similar words. So overall, the two halves were as similar as I could possibly make them. Just to give a brief overview of the results of the QPT so that you're aware from where we were starting from. So the mean score for the audio first group, so that's, as the name suggests, that was the group that started with the audio input and then got video input. The mean score there was 36.38. For the video first group, who started with video input and then got audio input, the mean score was 34.40. There was no statistically significant difference between the two groups on the basis of that. So that was, if you like, the starting point. So in terms of the lecture, as I said, students listened to the lecture twice and then they wrote the summary. The summaries were then divided into two halves, which represented the input from the two parts of the lecture. The summaries, so each summary was scored by up to 3 raters, and a fair average score was calculated for each person's performance on each half of the summary. So in terms of the results for research question 1, so this is, just to remind you, looking at how performance differs when lecture input is in the form of a podcast or a vodcast. I carried out a Hotelling's T-squared test, which is a variation on a one-way maneuver. And what you can see on the graph here, the red line here indicates the audio first group and the orange line represents the video first group. And on the left, you have the scores for part 1, and on the right, you have the scores for part 2. So as you can see, in terms of the results for the audio first group, the mean for the audio input was 4.006 out of 5, and the mean for the video input was 3.571. For the video first group, the video input was somewhat lower at 3.452 and dropped off a little bit further down to 2.886. So when I ran the Hotelling's T-squared, I found that there was a statistically significant difference between the two groups. So then I went ahead and did post hoc independent samples t-tests. And here you can see that the red line relates to the audio input. So this is the audio first group scores that we just saw, and the video first group scores here. And the orange line relates to the video input. So you can see that the scores here for the audio first group were slightly higher than the video first group, but they were very, very similar across the two halves. So this resulted in a statistically significant difference for the audio input between the audio first group and the video first group, but there was no statistically significant difference in the mean scores for the video input. But there was a statistically significant difference for the combined group means. So those were the quantitative analyses. I also analysed the data using Text Inspector. And these were the different analyses that I ran. Again, just for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on these results today and not look at the CEFR because that's a lot of data. So moving on to the results, what we can see is here in this table, we've got 4 main columns. We've got the audio first group audio input, so that's their first input, and then the same group, the audio first video input results. Then we have the video first group with their video input, so that's the first part, and the video first group with the audio input. And in line with the findings that we've just seen, we can see that generally the audio first group did better with the audio input, and the video first group did worst overall with the audio input. What we can see though is that there's a high type token ratio here. So at first glance that looks quite good, but we should bear in mind that a type token ratio of 1 is relatively easy to achieve on short texts which have no repeated words. And if we look at the token count across the 4 areas, if you like, for the audio first group, when they had audio input, the token count for the summaries was a mean of just over 195 words. For the video input, so in the second part, this dropped down to 110 words approximately. On the other hand, the video first group wrote on average just over 117 words when they were presented with video input, but this dropped off down to 82.569 when in the second half of their summaries when they were presented with audio input. So it may well be that because there are far fewer words, this had the impact here on the type token ratio. But what is interesting is that the flesh reading ease, if we look at that, you can see that for both video inputs, the texts that were produced were more complex than for the audio input. So here it's 65 approximately, and here it's 74. So remembering, of course, that with flesh reading ease, the lower the number, the more complex the text is. If we look at lexical diversity, MTLD, this is a more robust measure of lexical diversity. And what we can see here is that, again, for the video input, the texts were more linguistically diverse. So this might suggest that the video input provided some sort of support in terms of language. What we should also note here is that the lexical diversity here looks relatively high at 67.42 compared to the 67, 69 and 68 here. And that doesn't seem to tie in with the results. But what we need to bear in mind is that when Text Inspector analyzes MTLD, it cuts out any texts that are under 100 words. And in this case, it removed 10 texts. So it only analysed 48 out of the 58 texts for the video first group for their second part of their input. So that may have had a slight impact on skewing the results there, making it look like it was better than it was because only 48 of the texts were analysed instead of all of them. Okay, so moving on to the last 2 results for that. This is the AWL types and tokens percentage. And again, we can see that this was higher when both groups were presented with the video input and slightly lower when they had audio input. So again, this suggests that maybe the video was providing some sort of support that helped them make those more linguistically diverse and more academic texts. Okay, moving on to the results for our Q2. So this was looking at the extent to which test takers are influenced by what is written on EAP slides compared to what they hear. All the papers were coded for this qualitative analysis. So all the papers were coded by one coder, and then 25% of the papers were coded again by a second coder. So in this case, the number and the types of propositions that test takers reproduced from the input was counted, or were counted rather, and each matching proposition was coded according to the type of input, whether it was audio or whether it came from the audio or whether it came from the slides, whether it was a word level match or a clause level match or a sentence level match, and whether it was a paraphrase of the input or whether it was an exact reproduction of the input. Bearing in mind that the information that was on the slides was intentionally different to the words that I used as the speaker. So looking at the results, you've got a key here because there's a lot of codes here. But what we can see, which again ties in with the results that we've seen, is the audio first group reproduced most reproductions across the board, except for the sentence level exact reproductions from the audio. Now, obviously in this part, this is part one, so they didn't have access to the video. So these are the results for the video first group, and you can see that they were producing lots of exact words from the slides. They were producing lots of clause level reproductions from the slides, and a few sentence level reproductions came up as well. However, given that the audio first group reproduced altogether 496 words from the audio, even when we add together the words from the audio and from the slides, we still find that the audio first group was reproducing more in part one, which again ties in with the results that we've seen. Moving on to part two, though, the picture is less clear cut, which again ties in with the results that we saw for the video input. So we can see here that audio word level paraphrases was higher from the audio first group, with 31 compared to 13. But clause level paraphrases was very similar across the two groups. Again, sentence level paraphrases 31 to 28 was very similar, and word level exact reproductions 70 and 65 was also very similar. The video first group produced some slightly more clause level exact reproductions and considerably more sentence level exact reproductions from the audio compared to the audio first group here. But again, in this part, this is where the audio first group had access to the slides. So you can see they were reproducing a lot of information from the slides, with 107 word level reproductions, 71 clause level reproductions, exact reproductions, and 6 sentence level exact reproductions. So this suggests that both groups were making use of the video when they had it, and that was giving them some language to reproduce in the written summaries at the end. But in line with the results that we saw before, for the second part, the results were very similar in terms of what was reproduced. Okay, moving on to RQ3. With regard to test takers' perceptions of their performance, I asked them why they felt better when they were presented with one format rather than the other, and these are the results. So we've got in total 41% thought that video input was better. So we have 33% over here that said the text or visual helped them, and 8% said that the video was better perceived. Now those are their words, but I take that to understand that they could understand. I take that to mean that they could understand the video better. On the other hand, 15% in here felt that listening only was easier. And then some comments as to why they thought the video input was easier are here. So I'll just let you read those. And some reasons why they felt that the audio input was better. And then moving on to RQ4, which was why they felt they performed worse when presented with one input format rather than the other. So here we see that 21% in here felt that listening only was more difficult. What is interesting here, though, is that 17% said they didn't understand the input and 4% said that the speech rate was too quick. So that's kind of interesting, given that basically the speech rate was the same, was very, very similar across the two halves. And as we saw from the analyses, the difficulty measures were also very, very similar across the two halves. So in terms of the perceptions of why they felt they did worse on the audio input, these were some of the comments that I got. And similarly, some reasons why some of them felt that they performed worse when they had access to the video. Okay, so moving on to just summarize all of that, because that's a lot of information in a short time. There was a statistically significant difference in performance on the audio input, but not on the video input. Both groups performed better on the first part, irrespective of the format, which might suggest that there was a fatigue effect coming in the second half, possibly. But curiously, both texts, or interestingly, let's say, both texts were lexically more diverse and had more AWL types and tokens when the test takers had access to the video input, irrespective of the input order that they got that. For research question 2, we saw that there were more reproductions in part 1 than in part 2 for both groups. The only exception to that was the audio clause level exact reproductions for the video first group in part 2. But again, this may be due to a fatigue effect. Both groups made use of the slides when they had access to them. And in terms of paraphrasing parts 1 and 2, both groups and formats produced considerably more paraphrases at the clause level from the audio. In terms of the exact matches in part 1, both groups had a high number of exact word and clause level, exact word level matches from the audio and clause level paraphrases from the audio, although the video first group had fewer than the audio group in total. But of course, in part 1, they had a high number of word and clause level exact matches from the slides. In part 2, both groups again had a similar number of word level and clause level exact matches. The audio first group, unsurprisingly, also had a high number of word and clause level exact matches from the slides. And the video first group had more clause level and sentence level exact reproductions from the audio than the audio first group, even though they didn't perform as well overall in the summaries in the second part. For RQs 3 and 4, in terms of test taker perceptions, we said that 41% felt that they performed better with video, while 15% felt that listening only was better. 21% felt that listening was more difficult, and 14% felt that watching and listening together were difficult, and or they were distracted by the video. So in terms of how this relates to other research, the 41% that felt they performed better with video concurs with other studies, for example, from Pardo Ballester 2016, Progosh 1996, Suvorov 2008, and Wagner 2010. And referring to Meyer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning, Leverage and Yang in 2013 state that as audio input becomes too difficult, the L2 listener turns to the visual input mode, and this may be more easily understood. Thus, L2 listeners who don't have the listening ability required for the task may resort to reading rather than listening, and this may be the case in this current study. In contrast, only around 15% preferred audio, with some test takers stating that the video was distracting. And this also appears to be in line with other research, which has compared the two formats. For example, Koniam 2001, Gruber 1994, and Suvorov 2013. As with every study, there were some limitations, and the rating scale was arguably a limitation, potentially. The rating scale that was used was the CEFR overall written production scale, because this was pre-companion volume being published. The use of other scales, such as the reports and essays scale or the processing text scale, would have been useful, but it just wasn't possible due to time and cost implications for paying the raters to rate using multiple scales. And a specific scale being developed and validated just for this was just beyond the scope of the task. It would have required much more work just to validate the scale itself. In terms of the descriptors within the scale, obviously the test takers only had one text in as far as they only had one input. And the CEFR B2 descriptor for overall written production requires synthesis. So this may possibly have acted as a sort of ceiling effect for higher scores. So obviously, if this were to be replicated, it would be good to have a rating scale that's specifically designed for this task. In terms of the time allowed for the task, the students had 45 minutes. This had been increased from the exploratory study so that more people would finish, but still there were 9 students who didn't manage to finish writing. So again, those students may have performed better if they'd have had a little bit longer. So coming now to the implications and conclusions, the video may have provided scaffolding in the language, and that's helpful because obviously at the end of the day, students are at university to learn, and we want them to learn, but in an assessment context, we need to be aware that this might have a longer term negative impact. So if they start to focus solely or primarily on the written word, this may have a negative impact on their listening skills. So while it's useful for them to be trained in this multimodal environment, I think we do still perhaps need to focus on listening only skills. More learners perceived a preference for video input. So again, that might suggest that we should provide video input when we're doing EAP listening tests and practice. There is an argument that says that those who don't want to use video or don't want to be distracted by the video can turn it off if they want to. So, you know, at least there you've got both sides covered, whereas if you only provide audio input, then those who would prefer and would perform better with video are being disadvantaged. There's also an equality and accessibility issue if you think about providing input with audio only, because if students have access to video, those who are hard of hearing can also use the textual input and can read the speaker's lips to aid comprehension. So again, it may be biasing for best, in the words of Weir 2005, to provide video input as well. What we should be aware of is the impact of fatigue, though, and how comprehension drops off over longer lectures. Some research, for example, Bradbury 2016, suggests that 10 to 20 minutes is a rule of thumb for lecture input. However, edX in Inman and Myers 2018 recommends that input in an online lesson should be limited to 6 minutes, but that may be too short to replicate the TLU domain. Guo et al. In 2014 observed a drop-off in engagement between 9 and 12 minutes, though, and this research appears to support that, since performance dropped off in the second half of the lecture, which was between 6 and 12 minutes approximately. But as I say, we do need to focus on what is important. So while it might be a good idea to keep input chunks short, we do need to ask ourselves, does this reflect what happens in the real world? And that's what we need to think about ultimately, is what happens in the real world and what do we want to test. So at the end of the day, probably lectures are provided, well, the question is, are lectures provided as audio only or as audio visual input? Obviously, the audio visual input can provide scaffolding, so there is an argument for using video and PowerPoint. And Batty in 2015 recognises not only the authenticity of providing video input, but also the increased face validity that audio-visual input affords, and therefore argues that we should be not only teaching students using video, but also assessing using video as well. But as I say, I would argue that we provide both forms of input so that students have access to both the audio-visual input, but they don't lose those listening skills. So that's everything I want to say. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Lovely, Caroline. Thank you very much. That was a really interesting study, which has raised several questions. So we don't have much time, but I'm very quickly going to try and just get through a couple of those questions. First one is just to ask you about the amount of text that was on the slides and any overlap in terms of the text on the slide and the verbal script, as it were. Sorry if I missed that. I don't know whether you gave that information and I happen to have missed it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I did. So basically the spoken input was intentionally different, apart from, so the topic was on culture shock. So obviously the word culture shock did come up in both the spoken and the written input. But the spoken input was intentionally different to the words on the slides. On the slides, there were, so each half had 3 slides. One was a sentence, one had some bullet points. I can't remember, I did say at the beginning and I've forgotten now how many I said, and one had a diagram with 5 keywords. So the input was exactly, well, not the input, because obviously the input was different across the 2 halves, but the amount that was on the slides was the same. So 1 slide with 1 sentence, 1 slide with some bullet points, and 1 slide with 5 keywords and a diagram.
Thank you. And in terms of taking this forward in terms of, you talked then about some accommodations that testers could make to allow to the personal preferences of students. And I was quite surprised by that. I know I'm in the middle of some research at the moment, and I have had instances. I'm trying to eye track students while they look at slides and listen, and have had instances of students closing their eyes while they're listening, and saying, and when I've asked them about that, they've said, well, it helps me listen, that effectively shutting down. So I can relate to that. Do you think there's a level at which testers will be thinking about bringing in the video and this sort of integrated video and listening to writing? Do you think there's a level at which it starts, or do you think it's something that can cover the whole range of levels?
I think that's an interesting question, and I think it depends how you see it, because clearly, again, according to this theory of multimedia learning, weaker students rely on the spoken input. So there you would think that actually it would be better to start at a very low level. But then on the other hand, as you say, you know, sometimes people can't cope with the audio and the visual because there's cognitive overload. And because they haven't got the automaticity of processing the listening input, they then rely on the spoken word. So you would then think that the higher up they go, the less there is the need for that. But then the higher up they go, that's more reflective of the TLU domain, because that's more likely where they're going to be getting that multimedia input. So I would say, actually, personally, I think it would be useful to bring it in across the levels, because for me, it's always about, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to see whether they can survive in the academic domain, or are you trying to see how well they can listen? And if you're trying to see how well or how good their listening skills are, then obviously maybe you don't want that audio visual input. But if it's about, can they survive in the academic domain, then I would say, yes, that's what they're going to get. And that's what we should be testing them with and on, if you like.
That I was really interested to hear that, and you spoke that you gave several sources about that kind of 20-minute fatigue effect, and I have heard mentioned as a rule of thumb for teachers when they're teaching, that effectively you should be aiming to change the activity roughly every 18 to 20 minutes, because after that people lose that concentration and lose the ability to follow. So obviously in lectures, we do have lectures that go on for much longer periods of time, but I think most even native speakers would recognize that it can be challenging to maintain concentration after that.
Yeah.
So what do you, in terms of that, do you think when we look at the target use domain, that after the outside of the test environment, there aren't, to what extent do you think we should be aiming to test beyond that 20-minute window, given that even for native speakers, I think that 20-minute that fatigue effect begins to creep in?
Yeah, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have input beyond that 20 minutes, so therefore we wouldn't need to test beyond the 20 minutes. There is an argument that says, if we're flipping the classroom and we're giving the students the input to watch whenever they want, however they want, they can take a break whenever they want as well. So then, there's also the argument that says, well, my lecture is an hour long, I have to do an hour's lecture, they have to have the input, but they can watch it whenever they want to watch it. But then, that would mean if we're testing that and testing beyond the 20 minutes, we would have to allow them to go away and have a break as well. So, I think it's a case of, we do what we can to kind of match the TLU domain. If, as a teacher, I can provide shorter input chunks, then, if I know that's going to be effective, then that's what I would do. And then obviously, as a result, we don't need to test beyond the 20 minutes. So, in an ideal world, maybe we should think about just having shorter input chunks. And I know myself, because I'm rubbish, I know. If I'm doing a MOOC and a lecture is only, the input there is only sort of 5 or 10 minutes, and I'll still download the transcript, because I can read through the transcript faster than I can watch the video. And that's even over a very, very short time. And of course, that's the other side of it, is with the flipped classroom, students are getting transcripts, they're getting, all sorts of assistance. So it's more a case of trying to replicate that, I think.
Yes.
Haven't quite solved all the questions yet. Come back to me in a while. We might find in 5 years' time that there's no such thing as academic listening, because people can download the transcripts. So, this may all be a complete waste of time. But I think certainly we should try to replicate the real world as much as we possibly can.
Absolutely. Carolyn, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. Lots of comments there, and I see that Fumio very kindly has put the link to your PhD in the repository in the chat. So thank you very much, Fumi, for doing that. Okay, we've run out of time for today. So Carolyn, thank you very much. I'm just going to allow Tony to switch on his camera for a moment and just to say a goodbye and a final thanks.
Nikki, you are too kind. Thank you.
Okay.
So thanks everyone. Really nice to see everybody, and being back online, being able to bring in people from all over the world like this is really good. So look forward to seeing you again at the next opportunity, which will be our summer seminar. We don't have a set date yet, but we will keep you posted. So thanks for being with us, and see you next time.
Thanks all.